Hello, and welcome to the Rehydrate interview series, a forum for discussion of Liu Cixin's Remembrance of Earth's Past series. In each episode, I normally speak with a guest about their thoughts and experiences on reading the series, but this episode is going to be a little bit different. Spoiler warning for listeners, this episode will contain spoilers for all of the Three Body Problem, The Dark Forest, Death's End, and any other media we happen to discuss. I will include chapter markers in case you want to skip over those sections. My name is Dan, and today I am joined by Adam. Hi, Adam. Please tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, Dan. Thanks for having me. I want to preface by saying I have not read the Remembrance of Earth's, I don't even know the title, the Remembrance of Earth's Past trilogy, because I'm a translator of some of Liu Cicin's shorter fiction, or have been primarily, and I didn't want the style of Joel or Ken's translations to influence my work. So if you're looking for insight about those books in particular, I have absolutely nothing to give you.
And which books did you translate, or which stories?
So I did short stories primarily. The two that have been published, one was called Cannonball. That was in The Wandering Earth, which was the title of a story in the book that was later made into a blockbuster movie in China. And the second was called The Village Teacher, and it opened a more recent collection called To Hold Up the Sky. I think it was called Hold Up the Sky in the UK. And for that book, I also translated the author's foreword.
Cool. Well, thanks again for joining us. Yeah, speaking of the movie, since you bring it up, did you just see the movie, or do you just not, or do you read the other stories in the collections? Or I know
No,
you said you don't read the Remembrance Worth Past
absolutely not.
ones. No.
Occasionally, so one of my current projects is translating some essays of Liu's nonfiction essays, and he makes reference to a lot of particular contents of his stories and books. And my general tack is to get directly in touch with the translator and say, "Hey, do you remember how you rendered something?" But no, I don't. It's too embarrassing to read these for pleasure.
So going back, to the beginning, how did you learn Chinese, and like how did you become a translator? Like how was interest to you?
Which one should I start with?
How did you learn Chinese?
How did I learn Chinese? I started very late, actually. I went to Oberlin College in Ohio, where there's an excellent East Asian Studies department. I'd had some previous experience with Japanese. I spent a semester or summer, something there, on a homestay in high school. And I continued Japanese in college and picked up Chinese as well, and found I had a yuanfen, or a destiny, with Chinese. It was just really easy for me for some reason.
Interesting.
I later found it's actually very difficult. But but that initial burst of confidence carried me through 2 years of class, and then eventually to Beijing, where I bummed around from essentially my graduation in 2005 until the Olympics in 2008, when it became much harder to get a visa for a bum like me. So at that point, I moved back to the States, and I began teaching secondary school Chinese. To secondary means, I think, includes junior and high. I'm a teacher, and I don't know. And I did that for 10 years, and then I began translating.
And how did you get into translating? Is this something you wanted to do, or you just needed to pick up side work?
I didn't need side work, but teaching had become, for various reasons that I'm really, really happy to go into if you want. It was unfulfilling. I was teaching at a private school in Manhattan, and our school librarian, the middle school librarian, was in touch with my current client, whose stock in trade at the time were children's stories. And she got us in touch, and she said, "This guy's perfect for doing these tiny, simple, some were very charming stories for young learners of Chinese." And I think they're charming in their own right, not as educational stuff too. And so once I'd gotten 3 or 4 of those in, they said, "Are you interested in slightly longer form stuff?" This was in 2016 or 2017. And I said, yes. And so they sent me a list of Liu Cixin stories with some recommendations. They said, pick 2 or 3 of these. We recommend The Village Teacher. We think is going to be a hit. So I picked The Village Teacher, and I picked Cannonball because the Chinese title is preposterous. The Chinese title it translates literally to something like Huge Earth Cannon.
Oh, did you pick the title then, or was that title like the English title?
Yeah, in fact, there was a previous English translation by Holger Nam, whose translation was quite adequate, good even. I'm trying. It's my idiom to sound catty, but I really don't try to, and I don't mean anything catty. I think he's an excellent translator, but for various reasons that have to do with rights, I imagine they wanted the story retranslated, and so they brought me on, and I saw the Chinese title. I said that won't do. And so I picked Cannonball because, it's like, I don't know how, did you read the story?
I did, yeah.
You did read the story.
Yeah.
It's like you're doing a cannon, but it's like into a pool.
Yeah, I thought both. I mean, I read both of them. I hadn't read them previous to speaking with you, but I read both of them, and I thought, yeah, both of them were super interesting. We can get more into the story if you'd like, especially like, yeah, Cannonball. I thought, I know we haven't read Remembrance or past series, but like in that series, there's a common theme of hibernation and kind of jumping into the future. So it's kind of, I don't know like when this was written in relation to those, but it's very interesting to see for me like, oh, these concepts kind of carry throughout all of his work, and he has kind
Yeah,
of a style.
for sure. So he, as late as 2004, 2000. I'm actually looking at an essay I'm translating right now that was published in 2004, where he says kind of ironically or presciently. I'm talking about Liu Cixin here. He says, American sci-fi began with magazines and then gave way to longer form works. He says, I wonder whether Chinese sci-fi will do the same thing. So obviously this is before he wrote any of his long works, except I think for Ball and Lightning. I don't know if you've read that one.
I haven't yet, but I know of it.
Okay. Joel also translated that one, and he did an excellent job with it. He says, then my sense is that we'll need one or two novels that sell 1 million copies before the market for long-form works takes off in China. And then we'll need film adaptations, and then we can have a real qualified group of writers producing that kind of work.
You said you had lived in China for a while. Did you know about Liu Cixin before you started doing his work? Like, I
No.
get the impression he's very popular and very, very kind of famous in China, but I don't know like what level.
In 2008, when I left China, which were the year of the Olympics, as I noted, I think sci-fi was still sort of an insular pursuit in China, and I was definitely not connected to that scene.
I see.
So no, I didn't hear of him when I was in China. I heard of him first, I think, when I want to say Obama tweeted about three-body problem.
Yeah, he and every book it has like Barack Obama says wildly imaginative.
Yeah. I think he only said that once.
Yeah, but it's on all three books.
Yeah. So that piqued my interest, but still I didn't read it, and I still haven't.
Have you read other sci-fi, or are you interested in that genre at all?
I tend not to like fiction that I tend not to be drawn to fiction that centers more around ideas than around characters. Obviously, that's not a feature of all sci-fi, and it's not even a feature of all of Liu Cicin's sci-fi. I think he had a huge change of heart, in fact, in the early 2000s, where he began to feel characters really were kind of central to not just telling a good story, but as the without these scientists, these flawed characters, science wouldn't happen. And I think that's a link that has become progressively more important to him. And I think his prose has improved markedly as a result. And by all accounts, the Three-Body Problem is good writing.
Yeah, and I think specifically like that series, like it gets progressively better on the character front, So like
Right.
I think a common criticism of the first and second book are that just characterization is not as important as the scientific concepts. Where I think in the third book, he's a better job of marrying those two things together.
He says that explicitly in so many earlier essays he wrote from the early 2000s, late 1990, 1998, 99. He has what are essentially manifestos that are like, I don't give a shit about the characters. Like, these are the sci-fi. If I do any characterization in my books, it's because readers want that. But that's not the kind of stuff I want to write. Really, for me, the core of science fiction is science. And so he says, like, memorably, like Ball and Lightning, the main character in that book is Ball and Lightning.
Right.
He's like, and though there happens to be a protagonist and then another slightly crazier protagonist and this really militant military researcher, he's like, they all are there just to offset the Ball and Lightning, which is the most fascinating thing in the story. And so stuff like that it's hard for me. I've just never met Ball and Lightning.
Yeah, it's hard to
what it dreams about.
Yeah, I think that's fair. That's a fair thing to want in your stories, right? Is like more characterization. And so yeah, I think that's probably a general theme in sci-fi or in some sci-fi that like they care more about like the big scientific concepts.
And I mean, God bless him for it. And I don't think any other, I can't think of other literature that makes science, which is an important thing to know, obviously, so fun.
What genres are you into?
So I'm really into period pieces and like historical fiction
Okay.
and literary fiction too. But I have a soft spot as far as genre goes for historical fiction, and that's what I'm working on now.
Which periods? And like, is it Chinese historical fiction or?
Yes.
Okay.
This is all Chinese historical fiction, and there are two periods. The work I'm currently on takes place in the Tang Dynasty, which was, roughly 600 to 800 AD, something like that. So it's very early history, but it takes place primarily in the capital of the Tang Dynasty, a city called Chang'an, which is called Xi'an today. And that was a very kind of cosmopolitan, strange, tolerant, sophisticated place. And so I'm really drawn to this depiction of a history that I think is very unfamiliar to Western readers. Like,
Yeah.
there are a lot of like Zoroastrian characters in the book, and I don't remember the last time I encountered a prominent Zoroastrian character in genre fiction.
So when you were in China, did you get a chance to visit these sites?
I did.
Yeah, I also I went to Xi'an myself.
Oh, you've been to China?
Yeah. I've been to China a bunch of times actually. My wife is Chinese.
You're holding out on me.
Yeah. My
Where do
wife
you go?
Well, she's from Shanghai, so we've been to Shanghai
Okay.
a bunch of times. But I've been to Beijing. I've been to Xi'an. We went to Hangzhou. We went to Chengdu. Where else did we go? I think that's about it. But most of the time we just stay in Shanghai. But like every time I've gone like 4 or 5 times now, and so every time we go, we kind of try to go somewhere else.
That's fantastic.
What other places in China have you been to, and which is your favorite parts of China?
Oh, I've been all over the place. So I spent almost all my time in Beijing, but I before current travel restrictions and tensions, I was able to visit Tibet. I was able to visit Xinjiang, which I loved.
Oh yeah.
I went to Inner Mongolia more than once.
Oh yeah.
Which is just a spectacular place. Where else?
I always thought like Xinjiang would be really interesting. I mean, like my favorite city and all of the favorite thing I did in China was go to Xi'an, and I really like the food there. And so like I was like, well, I would really like to see like the even more authentic Xinjiang food. And so whenever we go to anywhere in China, we always try to go to like a Xinjiang restaurant.
Oh, fantastic.
Getting back to translating in general, so do you have any like interaction with the actual author when you're doing these things, or is it totally separated?
I have no direct interaction. As I'm working on a piece, I will send questions to my client that occasionally are as simple as like, I have no idea what this passage means, which used to be, when I was beginning, that was really embarrassing. But I think it's a universal. I hope it's a universal problem. The translators I've spoken to all say, we get in touch with someone and we don't know what something means.
Do you find that even particularly harder in sci-fi genre? Because like I'm thinking of Village Teacher specifically when they switch over to like the alien culture, and there's a lot of like very specific scientific concepts that we get into. Is that much harder to translate, and that's when you need to get notes, or like how do you go about that?
The science is the easiest part of science fiction as a translator because you can research it. If you look up, I said this in a previous press junket, but I stand by it. If you look up how to say cold fusion in Chinese, there's one answer.
Oh yeah.
And if you Google the characters for cold fusion, then the first result on Google is the Wikipedia page for cold fusion. So that is relatively simple, compared to some very subtle way of saying I love you, but it's complicated.
Yeah, I remember in the Village Teacher, there's like one part where the aliens or the whoever people were talking in like a way they're using some special way of communication that wasn't like it's obviously not using because like they make fun of the way we talk later on,
right?
And they have some other means of communication. Is that also kind of a direct translation?
It was like a smart field.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, I probably should have written it down, but yeah, something like that. Yeah, using their smart field, using some kind of field.
Yeah, they're communicating by means of some obscure something-based medium that we have no access to. Smart field was a pretty literal translation of that, actually. It was like a zhihui chang. I'd have to look again at the text, but it didn't require any special effort because there is no such thing as a smart field. So you can call it whatever you want.
Presumably these books are also, or these stories are also translated into other languages. So say like
I know
German or
nothing about
Japanese
that,
or
but
something.
yes.
Okay, so you never communicate with the other translators either?
No, 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 no.
No.
I
Okay.
barely communicate with you. It's been a fight to be able to communicate with the other English translators because these, I don't know, it's very solitary work, and we're often kind of siloed, and the community is quite small, but still there's work to be done in kind of bringing us together as, I don't know, like a cohesive community of people who are trying to like improve the game and increase the market. I think we work pretty substantially on our own with some extraordinary exceptions.
So there's no like conventions or anything that you guys all attend?
Conventions.
Or back when we could meet together in person.
You could barely arrange a tennis doubles match, though there's some promising up and comers.
So you mentioned a couple of times that you don't like to be influenced by other translators. Like, what are some
Right.
ways that you could be influenced, or that maybe you have been, and that you've tried to avoid? Like maybe like you're learning from past mistakes or anything. Like, what are ways that you could and you want to avoid being influenced?
I think my initial impulse to avoid other translators' work is kind of knee jerk, and just the feeling like I'm going to do this on my own. It's my voice will be in there. My voice will be in there.
Yeah.
That's a necessary artifact of translation, and it's why of every classic book, every book in the canon, there are 20, 30 translations or whatever. I think a big part of it is there are certain turns of phrase in Chinese and certain sentence structures that are not so effective rhetorically in English.
Are those like the forward phrases?
Yeah, I mean those are very problematic because they often have some metaphorical content that's a lot deader, I think, in Chinese than in English. And so if there's a 4-character phrase that they're called chengyu.
Right.
If a chengyu refers to your heart, for instance, it's really tempting to put the word heart in your translation. But I think if you use the word heart too often in English, it kind of it makes your prose sound kind of cheap or schlocky or sentimental.
Sure.
And Chinese just has a greater tolerance for that. There's that, but really what I'm referring to is Chinese sentences this is so technical. You can stop me as soon as I begin to bore you.
Oh, no, I'm interested in technical.
Oh, good. So Chinese sentences love to pivot on time and place phrases. So a sentence, in a kind of active, like action-filled paragraph, a part of the narrative would begin with like, just at that moment, or like suddenly, or like on the other side of the room, which is acceptable in English, don't get me wrong, but every Chinese sentence could conceivably begin like this. And if you copy that structure too faithfully, it really begins to jar in English. And I think some translators, so you asked how other translators might adulterate my work. I think some translators do excellent things, do kind of a really interesting kind of rhetorical judo in taking that structure, using it literally, and somehow making it effective in English. And I'm not talented enough to do that. So I put the time phrase at the end, like we do in English. And I don't want to be influenced to do otherwise, because that would be demoralizing and would decrease my output.
Another question I had for you is that I have a very, 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 very limited knowledge of Chinese and Chinese characters.
Well,
But
as I told you before the interview, your pronunciation is solid.
Oh, thank you. But so sometimes what I do is I have to go through like this, like when I'm preparing for the podcast, I want to look at like what the original text looks like, and I'll have to like kind of hunt and peck the 40 characters or whatever I know in Chinese. But one thing I did notice was that, and for some more like esteemed characters, like or older characters, they'll be referred to as nin, as the for the listeners, it's the more like honorific way or the more formal way to address people in Chinese. The question I have for you is how there's no really way to do that in English. So how can you like kind of translate those concepts between Chinese and English to kind of convey the same feeling of honor or reverence?
Well, again, I think conveying the feeling is a really good way of putting it. So instead of nin, obviously you can't translate word for word,
right?
But when we're speaking to someone we respect in English, we tend to adopt a different register in our speech. Maybe it's a little more formal. It's very context dependent. in English as well. So if it's, your grandparent, for instance, I don't know, maybe you would pick gentler words or gentler phrasings, or maybe you'd hedge a little more. Maybe your tone of voice, which is something you can't modulate too much in Chinese, or your tones change. Maybe you would talk in a slightly more submissive way. Like right now, I'm up talking, and it conveys a kind of deference that I think, on the level of a sentence or paragraph, can convey with some fidelity how Nin and other honorifics feel. A big one, a similar problem that shows up in Liu's work and a lot of other work, is that Chinese loves to put people's titles next to their names. When I was teaching, for instance, my co-teachers, I would call them 老师. I'd call them by their sing, and then I'd say 李老师. Even when I was speaking directly to them, which is kind of hard to imagine in an American high school, teachers in the faculty lounge fighting each other for the Keurig machine and calling each other, Mr. Smith.
Yeah, or like, Teacher Smith, right?
Teacher Smith, even better.
Yeah. I think another difficult concept there's a couple that I've kind of picked up and again, my cursory knowledge of Chinese like kind of helps that with a little bit, but like sometimes some of the characters refer to smaller character, like the younger characters like Xiao, or some of the other characters, like there's a character who has a nickname of Dasher, and so it's like, not knowing Chinese, like how do you understand that? I think it's a hard balance. And then on the other way, like Chinese also uses like calling people aunt and uncle or grandfather or grandma, even though it's not related. They just use those terms. So I guess like how do you kind of reconcile that for Americans or English speaking people to more understand these concepts that don't really translate?
Well, I have a slightly discursive answer, and then I'm going to get to the meteor question.
Sure.
I forget who it was, but I read someone recently wrote, white people are the only people on earth who do not call their parents' friends aunt and uncle.
Interesting.
Which I haven't done, I haven't read all the research, but I think that it's very, very common. It's not unique to Chinese to do that. And so I think I like maintaining that when I can, just like auntie and uncle and terms of affection like that, because they're really, I think it's to English's detriment that we don't have, you can either call your father's friends sir or by their first name or Mr. something, and all of them have these like infelicitous overtones, I think.
Right.
They don't sound intimate. And so the question really is, how do you convey the intimacy of a nickname or a term of endearment, which in English and in American English especially, I suppose, we reserve for very, very close friends and like childhood friends and lovers. And again, it's context dependent. And that's my answer to your next three questions too. Context, what do I mean? So there's a character in the book I'm translating now who's called Xiao Yi, little Yi, and everybody calls him Xiao Yi. It's not like, just his friends call him Xiao Yi. That's just his name in the criminal underworld he inhabits in ancient Chang'an. And I have a comment on my draft translation, on the side of the Word document, that I was in like a manic attempt to try and get his name in English. I have about 95 different options for what he could be called. They include Lil B, Beecham, list goes on and on. So yeah, that's a tough one. I find Xiao especially tough.
Especially the way it's spelled in English, for listeners.
Oh my God.
It's like, it's almost impossible to pronounce if you don't have any background in how to pronounce Chinese words.
I think, in fact, to build on that, I think Liu Cixin, just his name, is kind of a threshold of the works because it's got every hard pinyin sound.
Right.
So if you can get past the name of the author, then you'll be fine with Ding Yi.
Yeah.
Or that's a character from Ball Lightning, or I don't know who else.
He also shows up in
Oh, does he?
Remember It's Worth Past. Yeah.
Huh.
And actually, Ball Lightning shows up in Remember It's Worth Past too. It's
Ball Lightning, the phenomenon.
The concept, the scientific concept. It's a whole story. Like they kind of mention it in passing one time, and then I guess in the original Chinese, like ball lightning as the concept is actually like like a real plot point, but they removed it for the English translation because ball lightning hadn't been translated to English yet. So American or English readers wouldn't have known what that is.
I see. They had some energetic editors.
Yeah, he made a whole. Joel Martin did the second book, and he made up a whole new story. Or I don't know if Liu Cixin made it, or he made it, or they did it in combination. But yeah, there's a whole new like kind of plot point. So they didn't use ball lightning.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, that's a shame. It's a very interesting phenomenon.
You had mentioned a little bit. You kind of touched on using Word docs. I'm actually like I said, I'm really interested in the more technical aspects of things
Sure.
in general. So, like, what is your actual like technical process for translating work? Do you like literally have like the Chinese text on one window and then your Word doc in the other one? You're kind of just doing it, or like what is like the actual process, and how long does it take?
My answer is going to be it will reveal me as a rank amateur. My process is so primitive compared to very experienced translators. Though to be fair, they're generally doing more technical documents as well, and so they really need sort of consistency within the text as they're rendering things. For like legal documents, you can't screw up a heretofore or whatever. But I keep a word bank. I keep an extensive glossary for everything I'm working on. That I cross-reference to the text as often as possible. What else do I do? I use a translation software. I think that's standard now. They're getting very good. I don't know. Have you played with any translation software recently?
Do you mean like?
I mean like Google Translate or
yeah. So my translation process is often like copying a bunch of Chinese into Google Translate and like trying to like find like what it means, and then I'll go to my wife and ask her like, what does it actually mean? That kind of thing. So
totally.
I have a complicated translation process for my limited Chinese.
I would say mine is not much more complicated. Not much more complicated, except for the wife. I strongly recommend using Baidu Translate instead. It's stronger than Google Translate currently, and stronger than that is a program called DeepL.
DeepL, okay.
Which is just eerie and getting eerier. I use that. I want to say it serves more of a dictionary function for me. It can't catch idioms very well yet.
Right.
But it does a really good job when you have these long Chinese sentences of kind of breaking them into digestible chunks in English that accord with passable English style, which is really, really challenging as a translator because you can go all the way to the end of this page-and-a-half Chinese sentence and finally get to the grammatical subject as opposed to the topic, which came at the beginning. And so DeepL does a really good job of rearranging thoughts in a way where you can kind of pick out the corresponding chunks in the Chinese text and begin working from there. So that's one tool I use among many. I have several dictionaries. I love Plico. I don't know if you use that on your phone, but download it. And it is extensive. Just as a pure dictionary, it's very, very powerful. And what else do I use? I think my most powerful tool is my strict regimen, which is low tech, but I've learned about myself. And, I've been translating full time now for 4 years, 3.5 years. I cannot produce rendering of good a translation of good prose after 1 p.m.
Oh, really?
I keep my mornings completely open. I don't eat breakfast. I wake up early and I work until 1 p.m. and then I screw around however I manage to during the day or call Citibank and yell at them about overdraft fees. And then I edit in the evenings. So I find after dinner is my most effective editing time where I can go back and kind of prune what I wrote during the day and look for inconsistencies.
So how long does it usually take?
Yeah.
Like, do you have like a page, like a page count per day or so, or like what's the kind of metric that you're kind of aiming for to feel like you're really making like good progress?
I never feel like I'm really making good progress. I always feel a month behind. I've gotten faster since I began. I think when I began, I was doing 800 to 1,000 characters on a full day. And bear in mind, I was teaching then too, so it was really kind of a mental shift to go to my Saturday translation cloistering. Locking myself up with this text all of a sudden. It's very different from trying to manage a room full of kids. But now I'm when I'm working and I'm familiar with an author's voice, and I know most of the characters in a book, and there are a few surprises left. I can do 1,500, 2,000, 2,500 sometimes. Though that when I've managed to do 2,500, I've been really proud of myself, and then I go back to edit that evening, and I'm like, I may have to do part of this again.
So what is the 800 characters? What does that turn into, like, English wise? Like how many standard pages or so?
I would multiple. It really depends on the source text.
Yeah.
For sci-fi, I would say it's never quite 1-to-1. The Chinese is always going to be shorter. I think in terms of character count. I don't always may not be right, but often. I think it's the English. There will be about 1.5 times more English words than there are Chinese
I see.
characters in the text. Maybe a little less than that. So 1,200, 1,300.
I see.
Did you expect more or less?
I had no idea.
Well, it feels like not very much when you're working on it. And you can go down a research rabbit hole as long as you want. You see some phrase and you're like, oh, I want to learn everything about magnified electrons.
Yeah, I'm sure, especially in sci-fi, like you look at some Wikipedia article and be like, oh, that's interesting. And you're like, 4 days later.
And it feels relevant to the text when you're doing it. You're like, oh my God, if I don't know this, I'm gonna screw something up.
Yeah.
And then often you find out in the end it's something speculative to begin with. And so, the research was misleading and you've just wasted your productive hours. So I try not to research at all anymore. I just grope around in the dark and then fact check later.
So when you're translating a story, do you first read the entire story and then translate, or you just start right away?
I skim the whole story. I don't read it word for word. But I get the main plot points. I try to get the roster of characters. I focus especially on twists. I want to be able to foreshadow those effectively, because it's a huge pain to go back and like, oh, I didn't catch that reference earlier in the book.
Sure.
Because it requires a lot of. You'd have to go back to the source text a lot to do that. It's not just like monolingual line editing. But generally, I do that by approaching my client and saying, "Hey, could you tell me who the characters are and why they're important and what? Just give me a list of spoilers."
Yeah.
And that's what I work from. But smaller, sort of more scene setting narrative, I try not to read beforehand. I find when I'm sort of amazed by a translation, by a description of an environment, that I can carry that better into my writing when I'm actually amazed, when I'm reading it on the spot and I'm saying, God, that's a beautiful way to describe a courtyard or an artifact of some sort. And so as these details occur to me suddenly as I'm reading the source, I find they take on a position of special emphasis in my translation, and I'm generally happy with that.
And can you think, are there examples that like you come back to in your mind of like, oh, that this part or this phrase or this concept is really, really hard to translate? Or like, is there like an example you can think of, like this was particularly really difficult to deal with?
I've blocked most of those out of my mind. I mean, tons. Yes. I have sense memories of them. I can look in some translations of mine. It would take a while. But generally, those happen when it's not clear who the subject or the topic of a passage of narrative is. Like, there's been no pronoun for a while. Nobody's been named, and I just don't know who they're talking about. And so you can go very far out on a limb, thinking it's Ding Yi, who's lifting his arm and gesticulating and saying something passionately, and then you slowly begin to realize it may be someone else. You have no idea. And by then you're so far gone that you don't know quite what to do with the text from there. I mean, you can't erase it, but it's demoralizing. So you
right.
email your client and you say, who the hell is this talking about?
Are there concepts or things that are more culturally sensitive in China versus here that you have to like kind of be more careful about your language around? I think particularly like Three Body Problem opens up with a big section about the Cultural Revolution, and the kind of the implications of that. So
Yeah,
I can imagine it's pretty difficult.
That's the one part I read.
Okay. Yeah, I saw there was an excerpt from that in Wandering Earth, so maybe it was like right after your story. um,
Mhm.
but yeah, like I'd imagine like kind of conveying those concepts in a culturally sensitive way would be pretty difficult. So have you run into those kind of things, and like how would you kind of approach them?
You're talking about historically sensitive. Sorry, can you rephrase a little bit?
Sure. So, for an example, would be like if I was an American writer and I wrote about the Trail of Tears or something like that, something that like
Right.
or slavery or something that like we're kind of embarrassed about as a country, you know,
Hmm.
that
Yeah.
for other people to translate that, like you'd want to like treat it with the same kind of feeling that we have. So presumably there's stuff like in China that has the same kind of feeling, and maybe the Cultural
Hmm.
Revolution is one of those things. And there's probably other stuff that China doesn't like to super talk about, right?
Right.
So I guess have you run into those kind of issues, and like how would you deal with them?
Have I run into those kind of? Yes, I have. I mean, I think there's a ongoing struggle in every country. I think it's very pronounced in the U.S. right now and in China. Whether history is meant to be, what the difference between history and like hagiography. To what extent the purpose, people in the U.S. now are talking about critical race theory, and there are two very strongly opinionated camps about the value of casting a critical light on American history. And as far as I can tell, one camp is saying, no, the purpose of history is to bolster a positive image of the country. And there's a similar thing in China. I mean, I think in China that there is, even now. I'm It's so sensitive to to me that I don't quite know how to put it. But I mean, there are a lot of events in the last 70 years of Chinese history that are central to that nation's identity, regardless of how painful they are, and even in some cases because of how painful they are. So, do I approach them with sensitivity? How do I approach them with sensitivity? I'll tell you what I don't do. In those cases, I try to translate as literally, as soon as a passage is clearly a live wire, culturally, I try to translate as literally as possible, to the extent that the language can be stilted sometimes, because I have this feeling that if I change a single word, then I've become like a belligerent in the debate. I've taken a stance. But then I have some deniability. If I say I'm just a conduit for the for the original language, you may as well just plug it in the Google Translate or something, which is obviously never the case. But with sensitive things, I think literality is, if not the best way to approach it, at least a solid defense for the translator. It happens more often in reverse, I found. So I only translate from, and this is standard practice, from Chinese to my native language, which is English. Often when I'm translating a work, there is a characterization or a cultural trope or a plot point that makes my ears turn red when I see it, and I email my client and I say, you got to change this. This is box office poison. And so when that occurs, I try to be really energetic in making it, if not more palatable, at least putting those sentiments in the mouth in a. Trying not to give those sentiments to an omniscient narrator, and make them sound as if they're unchallengeable fact. But it's really tricky.
Yeah, I can imagine.
The whole job's tricky. But can I speak a little bit about a current example of that?
Definitely.
So the book I'm translating now is called "The Longest Day in Chang'an," is my working title. No, it's not my working title. That's the title of the series on Amazon.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
I saw like the first episode of it. My
How'd
wife
you
said it's
like?
really good. Yeah, I liked it. It took it was a little hard to get into, I think, but I always meant to get back to it because I do like historical fiction too. And my wife described it as like Game of Thronesy and like a real historical setting. So
Yeah,
she thought I would like it, and she really liked it too. And she watched in the original Chinese. But yeah, like I've always meant to get back to it.
it's a fantastic hit, and it's a super high budget show. There are a lot of barriers to entry if you don't. It, I think of it as, in certain ways, not in terms of quality, but in terms of sort of how it treats history as kind of like Dan Brown.
Hmm.
Did you read Dan Brown recently?
I haven't. I know
Dude,
generally, like, yeah, he's the what was I forgot
Da
what it's called.
Vinci Code.
Da Vinci Code, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mystery kind
Amongst
of
yeah,
adventure mystery kind of guy, right?
adventure mystery kind of guy, but mixed with sort of common knowledge about history.
Hmm.
And so, he liberally inserts these fictional elements into historically acknowledged narratives. So he'll talk about, now I'm not thinking I'm thinking of National Treasure. Did you ever see that movie?
I haven't seen it, but I know of it. Yeah, where
Okay, you know
they
of it.
steal the Constitution or
Yeah,
the
exactly. They steal Nick
yeah,
Cage steals the Constitution.
right. That's all I know.
or he stops the person doing whatever it is. And they make references to all these real places. They're like, oh, there's like a vault under the Capitol, or I don't know any of the details. These are all just speculative. And like, if you research it, it turns out there is in fact a vault there or something. Like the author did their research. However, there is no, Indiana Jones style like pedestal with a copy of the Constitution on it. And so in subtler instances, you have no idea which parts are real and which aren't, and trying to research it is a nightmare if you don't have that background. So that's a big barrier to entering this show and this book. So anyway, my title is not The Longest Day in Chang'an. My title is The 12 Watches of Chang'an. And its main antagonists so far are a group of they're from a historical polity called the the latter Turkish Khaganate, which was a nomadic steppe tribe north of China, and their Chinese name Tujue has purely historical resonance. It's like saying Hun in English. It doesn't make you think of anyone alive today, except maybe I don't know. Hun, I mean, when I say Hun, do you think of anyone?
Attila the Hun, I guess.
Yeah, Attila.
Right.
But no group
Yeah.
that's a majority in a country or even a minority in a country. It's no longer a designation of a group of people. However, in English, we call this steppe empire or Khaganate the Turkic Khaganate, because the people were ethnically Turkic. And so as soon as you see that in English, you recoil a little bit and you say this reads like it's talking about Turkish people. And I still don't have an answer for how to handle that in English. So if any of your listeners do, they can email me.
Okay. Yeah, I wish I had a good answer for you.
So there's stuff like that even in the original, it's not super problematic, but I haven't yet found a way to translate it that doesn't insert a weird kind of modern political parallel that doesn't exist in the source. So yeah, I think it's generally harder going from Chinese to English than going from Chinese to English than trying to sensitively represent events of Chinese history in translation, because generally there are in the original text, in the source, they're already the author's tiptoeing around them to begin with, but not the Turkic Khaganate. They speak very explicitly about their evil sky worshipping ways.
So I know in English, English as a language is like continually evolving. So like we're always
Right.
like making up new words for new concepts, and presumably Chinese is also doing the same as we get more globalized world or whatever. So how do
Yep.
you keep up with like the changes in Chinese language? Do you watch a lot of contemporary Chinese TV shows, read magazines? What kind of thing do you do to keep up with just the language?
I mostly read criticism of my work on the Chinese internet. It's extremely colorful. There's a lot of new neologisms. What do I do? I try to keep up with the Chinese internet as much as I can. I think Yahoo Answers is now defunct. I don't know if you ever went on that site, but there's a Chinese equivalent called like Baidu.zhidao.com, and people ask just preposterous questions as they used to on Yahoo Answers. Like, does anyone know of an eyelash curler for particularly big eyes? was one question I saw recently. Then the answers were filled with what must be new language because it ain't old. And I read books. I read literature. I try.
Yeah.
I'm a fan of Ma Boyong, who won the Nobel Prize. However many, I've lost track of the years since the pandemic, so I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Who knows?
12 years ago, 3 years ago, I have no idea. But he won the Nobel Prize. He has a wonderful kind of straightforward, even laconic style in a lot of his stories. And I think his prose is like a masterclass in effective Chinese storytelling and style. As far as new language goes, a lot of it is internet slang.
Right.
I think a precursor to new language in Chinese is dialect, which has been around since forever and is rapidly evolving. But not too much dialect makes it into widely published books. Some does.
And even I thought the written language is always the same no matter what the dialect, but is that not true?
Well, I mean, the characters are the same, but I mean, there are different usages. Even if you go from what's the Mandarin spoken in Taiwan to standard Mandarin in China, which are more similar than most things that are distinguished as distinct dialects in mainland China. But there are usages that kind of parallel the difference between American and British English, say. Like, I know what you're talking about for the most part. It's just a change in terminology. So they're not using new characters for the most part.
So I don't know if this is going to be easy for you to do, but there was one translation that I thought was very strange in one of the books, and I was interested to see what your take is on it. So I won't give you the English one, but I'm gonna paste the Chinese in the chat. I guess, like, in a general sense, like, how would you? I don't know how quickly you can do it, but like how would you say that? And then I'll tell you like what the translation was and why I thought it was strange.
So he's talking to a doctor, and he really appreciates who's talking.
Oh, so it's a general talking to a doctor. Yeah, the general, the first person speaking, and then the doctor is responding.
Okay. So, I mean, off the top of my head, I very much appreciate your unique way of thinking. Way is maybe a little generous. Your unique thoughts. And it could be that this is precisely the crux of the matter. That this truly is the crux of the matter. How am I doing so far?
Good.
Thanks. The doctor responds, "Thank you. We really, all of us really are, I might say, modern Neanderthals. I like Neanderthal. It says primitive people.
Yeah.
Or primeval people. 原始 most often means.
So the interesting part of it is so you got the first one pretty much, like how he said it, but like the way he translated the second one, he says, "Thank you. All of us are basically Flintstones." I was like, how? There's no way Chinese people know who the Flintstones are.
I love that translation. Is that Joel?
Yeah.
Oh my, he's an artist. I love that. What's wrong with it?
I was like, I know what that is, but like Chinese people aren't going to know it. But I guess Chinese people aren't reading the English translation.
No, they read the Chinese version.
Right. So yeah, I thought it was like, when I was reading it, it just kind of took me out of it for a bit. I was like, that's a very interesting choice of like how to translate that because like when I go back to it, I was like, there's no way that translates to Chinese that way. And then like, anyway, that was a very interesting use case, I thought.
It must have made you aware how far Hanna-Barbera had penetrated the Chinese market.
I asked my wife; she had no idea what the Flintstones were. Of course,
I love that choice. I love how energetic it is. And as a translator, I love how I know I have a gut feeling how much fun it was for the translator to choose that word. And that usage. So to some extent, it was maybe a joke on Joel's part a little bit, or a way of amusing himself. But I think I really appreciate his unique way of thinking. 我真的很 I'm quoting the general. I think the question is, how would Flintstones ever show up in a Chinese? There are a lot of phrases like this in English, a lot of metaphors.
Yeah.
In English, we speak in poker metaphors a lot of the time, or baseball metaphors.
Right.
And it's kind of baked into American English. Like we use these all the time when we're being informal. What's an example of a poker metaphor? The company
Yeah.
folded.
Yeah.
Which means it closed. I think that must be a poker metaphor, but if it's not, there are many other examples.
Like caught it on the river or something like that. Right?
Yeah. And I often wonder when I'm translating Chinese texts, when would that part of the English language, which is super common, ever show up in a translation of a Chinese text if it weren't a deliberate choice of the translator? Like, how limited would English be if the translator didn't make joyful choices like Flintstones?
Right. Yeah, and
I think
it conveys his thought, right? Like, and the original thought, probably, like it seems to be what he is trying to really convey, and in a very, very colorful way.
Colorful and pithy, and I like that it knocks you out of the text a little bit too. It's kind of a wink toward the reader that maybe the original isn't quite so much. Even though modern, the word that means modern in the text, is a transliteration of modern from English. So it also has that kind of, there's something kind of artificial about how it feels in the text. And so I think Flintstones is great. And I hope to see more translations that refer to Hanna-Barbera cartoons.
Do you have ways people can find you or contact you if they have more questions for you? Or like what are ways that you would like to engage with people? And then what are some things that you're working on that you want people to check out?
How can they get in touch with I just made a Reddit account under my real name, which is Adam Lanphier. So feel free to, I don't know, what do what people do. You dox me. I don't know if people do on Reddit. How else could you get in touch with me? I don't have a Twitter. I don't have a Facebook. I have an Instagram, but it's mostly pictures of a hut I'm building in my backyard. So don't go to that. Email me. You know what? Email me at adam.lanphier@gmail.com. Whoever you are, I welcome any of your readers to do that. And then currently what I'm working on once more, I'm contracted through the heat death of the universe to translate long-form historical fiction novels. I've just signed my life away to these contracts. And I'm enjoying it very much, but I'm blessed to have so much work. But it's daunting when I think about the pure word count in front of me. But I love both the works. They're both by an author called Ma Boyong, who's extraordinarily popular in China and more or less unheard of in the States. I think a short sci-fi story of his was included in, do you know the anthology Invisible Planets?
Sounds familiar, but...
Okay, so it's an anthology of kind of lesser-known sci-fi authors, Chinese sci-fi authors' works. Ken Liu translated the whole thing.
Oh, I did read. I read the Liu Cixin story out of that one. That was the one where about the energy, right? Where they kind of jump in the future, or he gets calls from himself in the future, right? Is that the one?
No, I didn't read that one.
Oh,
I read the Ma Boyong one because I was just beginning to translate his stories, and it was this touching little sort of 1984-ish vignette of surveillance and protest, and it's a nice intro to his work. Anyway, I think that's the only, based on nothing, I think that's the only work of his that's been thoroughly and professionally translated in English so far. So I am doing the rest of them, not the short work so much, but his long form novels. So the first one again is called, my working title is The 12 Watches of Chang'an. You can check out a high budget, fascinating TV adaptation. It's available on Amazon Prime. The title there is The Longest Day in Chang'an. I'm also working on a book of his called Gudong. My working title is the Bureau of Antiquities, and it is about the thrilling trade and fields of authentication and forgery in the world of Chinese antiquities, and that one takes place in a very lush early 90s Beijing setting, which you can tell by the enormous cell phones they keep referring to in the narrative, among other things. So read those.
All right. Well, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciated our conversation.
Can you use any of it?
Use all of it. It's great.
All of it.
All of it.
Okay, good.
But yeah, thank you very much. I really appreciate your time.
I just want to say I've never been interviewed before. So
yeah, hopefully this is easy enough, and yeah, our conversation.
I was so nervous going. I haven't been that nervous in either 3 or 12 years. I can't remember.
Oh, you're great. I think it'd be very interesting to our listeners, because like our listeners will be more generally more generally into the world of Remembrance Earth Past, but I think also like are interested in Chinese culture and other Chinese stories in general. So I think
great.
This world is very close to like a lot of our core interests. So I think a lot of people will be interested in these books, and either the books or the TV show of the longest day in Chang'an, or any of that stuff. So yeah, I think it's interesting to me, and hopefully interesting to our listeners as well. All right, well, thank you very much again. I really appreciate it. I don't have a good way to end it, but thank you very much.
Dan, you're very polished. I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me, and I'm flattered that you wanted to in the first place.
Definitely appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Stay in touch. Bye now.